while people are making their way up to the microphones, I'll just start with a kind of broad question. We've got many different perspectives here from the machine learning, data science world and the clinical world. What are some of the challenges that you see in bringing these two worlds together and meaningfully transferring data science, AI into the clinical setting?
Well, I can start. Definitely from the health system side, we want to incorporate as many things as possible, as quickly as possible. We still see cost as a barrier where we have a lot of cool technologies, but the cost to implement them and ultimately track them over time, just from a people perspective and change management, is really high. So I know this is something we're very aware of, that the projects that we choose and the technologies we implement have to be manageable long term and not just through a pilot phase.
Absolutely.
I think I'd like to see much more robust human factors considered in all of these deployments. I was telling you, I trained this fancy model, and I had several hospitals say, "Can we deploy that?" And my response was, "Well, when? At morning rounds, or do you want me to text it to you? And colors, pictures, like what?" Actual text. These are not questions that a machine learning researcher or a machine learning model should be tackling. There's a whole robust, deployment science space that needs to be investigated, because when I asked the collaborator, what AUC do you want? What accuracy do you want? What positive predictive value? He said, well, I can look at two things in the morning. You just pick the two things, which is a very different objective function, I think.
And from my perspective, I think that one of the things that contributes the most to success in some of these projects is really deep conversations between clinicians and machine learning researchers. I think I've found for myself, just the more you really, understand deeply about a problem, not just, okay, this is the data set, this is the initial clinical problem, but I want to understand, how is this going to be used? What are the weaknesses now? Also, I want to understand what are related problems, and to be able to synthesize all that together, which informs how we actually want to design these algorithms. I think that makes a big difference from my perspective, and I think that also from the clinicians we've collaborated with, I think their finding has also been that the more time they spend understanding how machine learning actually works, what are the capabilities, it can also help them think more clearly about, how should we tackle this space of problems? What should we do first? What are the challenging cases and problems that we should, discuss in more detail and convey to the machine learning researchers so they know how to tackle those.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time in teams as part of the center, and I think that's one of our strengths. We have clinicians, we have computer scientists, but we also have law students and business students and others. I think that really helps us sort of think about the comprehensive work that is required. I mean, the last mile is obviously the hardest. I'm sure that's been said many times. And getting these things deployed and having them used and then evaluating them in that setting is not trivial. And the more we can get computer scientists and other experts from around the university and certainly around industry to join us and work with us on those problems, it makes everything better. And so that's what we've really found is, multidisciplinary teams are key.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. And I think, really having the experts in the change management and the deployment and the implementation science, clinical informaticists, is key. And I think one of the things that you guys have touched on is it's important to understand the quality of the model, but then also thinking about what is the intervention piece, and is it worth doing that intervention, and how do you set the cutoffs for that model?
Just to kind of add on to what Serena was saying, just have an example of failure from our side. Right. We didn't communicate well enough with our physicians on our deterioration model. We wanted to send real-time alerts to doctors who are rounding, interrupt their day and say, go immediately to this person. And we thought it would be the model would be the best if it could predict it as early as possible, right, which turned out to be wrong, as a wrong assumption on our part, because we didn't really have those conversations. We kind of just assumed, obviously, they'd want to know earlier. That's not the case. They wanted to know at the sweet spot where we know that they're deteriorating and I still have time to do it, but I don't want to know 12 hours beforehand because I'm going to show up and just kind of shrug my shoulders. Mm-hmm. So like that was a failure on our part, not having those conversations and involving those physicians early enough on, where we trained the model incorrectly, and we had to go back, redo the model, and then tailor that at the 4-hour mark. And then after that point, they started liking it, and then they embraced the model a little bit more and worked with it better.
Great example. All right. We'll take our first question from the audience.
Thank you. So I have a question. I'm a biomedical engineer also working with patient health data. And I'm very concerned about two things. First of all, is when I design a machine learning algorithm, I would like it to be used in a hospital. But I don't know if there's any strategy when it comes to be, if it needs any FDA approval, or if it's it can be legally used in a clinic. And secondly, I don't really know how physicians feel about using algorithms, especially when it comes to diagnosis. Are they reluctant to use it? Are patients also, so what do patients feel being diagnosed by an algorithm rather than a person?
Matt, do you want to?
Sure, yeah, I mean,
to
your latter question in terms of how patients feel, I think, we're in a Silicon Valley, so it makes our, sales job a little easier in terms of, is this a good idea or not, right? But that's not true everywhere. I think that there has been plenty of discussion regarding the interpretability, and we've talked about it here as well. Not every physician needs to see that it's interpretable. We use scores all the time that we have no idea the logistic regression that even the data sets that they're based on. In fact, the Wells score, for example, for determining whether someone is at high risk for a PE, did you know that was a small group in Europe that study was based on, and yet we apply it to everybody, right? So we don't know a lot of the things that we claim to know, and so I think that the interpretability might be slightly overblown. But in terms of physician adoption, I think what is important is having a physician in the loop or a clinician in the loop. And you may have noticed from some of the things that we've talked about, no one is saying we're going to completely eliminate the need for radiologists or whatever that whatever function that model may perform. You have a physician in the loop that knows right and wrong and can have some clinical judgment. And that's critical, I think, for deployment. I think ultimately that'll be critical for how these models will be used. And there's plenty of precedent for that, just it didn't have the term AI used when it was put into clinic.
So one thing that Serena pointed out that I really liked is, burnout is real, right? There are extraordinary demands on a clinician's time, and often we're demanding that they interface more with medical record systems or devices than with the patient. They're not incentivized to spend any time with the patient. But there are many really nice papers that have come out recently that have shown pretty robustly that compassion is a really strong explanatory variable in patient recovery, right? So I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago in front of a mostly tech audience, and one of the questions was, so you're saying that you can improve medicine, you can make more doctors like Dr. House. And I was like, did we watch the same show? He was a horrible person. He's a drug addict. So no, I don't think that the goal is to make more doctors like Dr. House, right? It's the opposite, right? If you have tools that can improve some of these tasks that we know are really bad, right? We know that they are cumbersome. We know they take a lot of time. We know that they don't allow you to provide the same attention to compassionate care. Then maybe we can actually improve healthcare in the clinic.
All right, next question.
Thank you for the talks. And I have two questions for Matt. And the first one, when you say we can use the CT scan images for diagnosis, and I'm wondering if you also include the clinical information, like the characteristics for the patients, can you make an even better diagnosis? Do you have a conclusion?
Great question. That's actually something we're doing right now. One of the many projects is, I think what she's asking, if anyone didn't hear that, but is to use clinical information as well as the pixel data together to make better decisions. And clearly that's what radiologists do, right? What you've just said, the other piece I'd add to that is using priors, right? So a lot of radiology is saying what's changed from the last time to this time, but having that clinical context is exactly what we're working towards. And we sort of touched on that with the TB model, as you saw. That's such a difficult problem that chest x-rays don't give you all the answers. We found when we have ground truth, the chest x-ray can't tell you everything you need to know. You also have to know how that HIV positive patient is doing with their HIV, because if they're incredibly immunosuppressed and there's an opacity in a suspicious region, that's highly likely to be pushed towards one diagnosis over another. And so that clinical information is critically important. Now, in terms of CT scans, one interesting thing that we found, and I don't know if a lot of people know this, but you see a lot of these models that are able to detect intracranial hemorrhage, for example, right, on head CT. One group tried to use age to improve the performance of the model, and what do you think happened when they used age? Nothing at all, because if you show a model enough examples of someone's head at all these different ages or whatever, it's already taking that into account. Right, because as you age, your brain shrinks a little bit. You get calcification. There's all these things that happen to you. So the model already knew how old you were, whether you told it or not. And that was a really interesting finding. So I think having the clinical context and what we're trying to focus on are things like absolute change in labs or vitals or other critical things. We're specifically thinking about PE in our lab for this project. But that's a great question.
I have another question. Like, when you say maybe in the near future we can use this, or the doctors can use a smartphone for using deep learning models for diagnosis, but I'm wondering the current smartphone can hold so many layers in a model. What's your plan to boost the DL model in the smartphones?
Right now, it still runs off the cloud. And that's the one limitation. You'll need some internet connectivity. That's a good point. When doctors are using this, the target audience, at least at this point, for some of the trials, actually not as much in the Stanford setting, or actually in other healthcare systems that I'll the moment leave unnamed. But they actually have to wait sometimes 2 to 3 days for a decision. They're in an urgent care. And so they actually just need to confirm what they believe is happening. So these are more modern healthcare environments. But to your point, we'd love to get to a place where we're at full edge deployment, and that's still an ongoing effort. I mean, everything I showed you is very, very new. Yeah.
Thank you. I have one more question for Serena. Sorry. Okay. In your pilot study, in the hospital, you use a sensor camera to catch activity in the hospital. Also, in the later, you use the real cameras to catch other scenes. I'm wondering in which case the sensors are better than videos, or if you use the videos at the beginning, whether the challenges around the sensors can be tackled.
So I think if I understand, your question is, how does our choice of, for example, depth sensors affect our recognition ability of our algorithms as compared to if we were to use standard color cameras? Yes. I think that with there are different modalities, right? So with color, you can obviously get a lot of appearance information. You get typically also very high resolution information if you'd like. With depth sensors, they're typically a lower resolution, and you don't have that appearance detail. And so these are advantages where color has benefits. On the other hand, depth does have some advantage in the fact that because you have this distance information, it's very easy to segment people and objects to know that someone is standing in front of another person or where an object is without needing to reason on the appearance of these. So there are some benefits with depth as well. I think overall, it is still typically easier to recognize things and to achieve good performance using color data, but you can certainly do a lot with depth already.
Thank you for the answers.
Thank you. I think there's a question in the back.
Hi. So my question is, how do you grapple with adversarial perturbations with regards to the CT scans? Like, do you ignore it because of the implausibility of that data being injected into your system? Or do you regularize your models? And were they considered when you looked at the, when you're showing the bar plots? the radiologists were not susceptible to those adversarial perturbations, but the ML algorithm surely was?
Great question. I think we haven't spent a lot of time, concerned with all the different perturbations that you can create to fool the model. I think we talked about, what we're less concerned about some, again, not that we're not concerned at all, but a nefarious character trying to, fool into saying there's a hemorrhage or not hemorrhage. But one thing that is real, and one thing I should have mentioned about the knee MRI project, we didn't, cherry pick the test set or the training data. We didn't take out all the ones that had motion or knee replacement surgery, right? These are real world situations that break models all the time. And if you haven't taken those things into account, so I would actually focus more on real world problems. In fact, we had, again, going back to the concept of a hemorrhage model, pretest probability is higher if you're seeing a lot of motion artifact on the head CT because the person's probably got a head bleed and can't sit still, right? And they're being scanned. So, there are things like that. But I put more in the bias category. But in general, though, it's really important to see how these models actually perform on real-world data. So we tend to try to take prospective, straight off the scanner. We don't try to, again, cherry pick, because I feel like that, as you're suggesting, will end up causing more problems than they'll solve. But no, we haven't spent time specifically looking at how to avoid, hey, I want to screw up this guy's model and say everything's hemorrhage or whatever. Yeah.
Next question, thanks.
A single question here. Ross Vienna Vaccine Safety Initiative. I just wanted to take the opportunity that so many of you have experience in pediatrics, and I find that particularly interesting, being a pediatrician myself. And then we had the previous session where we were talking a lot about patients taking ownership of data. I think you see where I'm going with this. So we had a lot of top-down solutions, but many of you gave some refreshing ideas about what patients, how they could benefit, but I'm really interested in how we could tackle this, get some more pediatric ownership of data, or helping children grow into the world of medical AI, understanding what is being done with the data. I know, are you evolving the child life service? Where are we headed with this? I think it's a fascinating question. I'm always stunned how kids understand much quicker if I'm trying to get an informed consent than the parents, and then they explain to their parents.
All right.
So where are we headed with this is my question.
Jeez. I'll take a stab at, this is actually one of my areas of intense interest. So I think pediatrics is particularly challenging for multiple reasons, and Rebecca got to a little bit of the issues of the patient privacy in pediatrics. So you have to think both about those unique privacy issues of both the young children and the adolescents who do have access, depending on the state, to certain information that their parents don't have access to. And on top of that, there's questions about what should their parents be able to share when they do have access. So I think there is so much discussion that we need to have in pediatrics about giving patients and children and proxies control of their data. But I definitely agree that the world is changing, and I think it's going to become incumbent, it's going to become the role of pediatricians to train young, teens and adolescents and prepare them for taking care of their own health as young adults by training them on what data do you have access to, what are the tools that you should know how to use, how do you keep that safe, what is privacy, and how can we help you transition into young adulthood. This comes up often for complex pediatric patients, with complex health disease, but I think it could be even more fascinating for your healthy adolescent who is about to go off to college and about to be on their own for the first time, and how could we send them off with their own data, with their own set of tools to help them start an early, healthy adulthood. So I think there's a lot to be done here, but there are so many complexities that we really need to talk through as a nation.
Maybe next year, a whole session on that.
Exactly. Happy to do that one. Yes, definitely my interest. All right, we've got another question in the back.
So I have a question on intellectual property and how you can do some public good. All of you on the stage are doing public good in many ways, right? But it's in a silo. So how can data and algorithms be shared so that we can get most out of it? But how can also we can protect intellectual property?
I think one thing to, maybe distinguish, right, is what space you're talking about, right? So often if you're an academic, right, you write a paper, it is increasingly common now in the machine learning community that you open source your code, right? At least the modeling portion of your code is open. And there is an increasing push in the machine learning for health community that data comes with the code, with vetted access when appropriate, right? So the Mimic data set has vetted access. But if I write a paper on Mimic on predicting septic shock in the Mimic data set on those 40,000 patients, any other researcher in the world can apply for access, and within a week, they can download Mimic to their GPUs, they can download my code, and they can run my model and verify that I did what I said I did, and then try to deploy it in their own data or in similar data, right? And the Checkspert labeler, I think, is a similar example of, there was a great paper, there was a data set released with that paper, right? And there was a labeler released with the paper as well. So you can do this now on your own data set as well, right? And so I think examples like that are hugely motivating. And I think a lot of us within the community are pushing for more examples of data that is open to vetted use, that's been de-identified appropriately. I think the question you ask about IP is harder when you have, we are in Silicon Valley, right? When you have, sort of companies and maybe other interests at play.
I guess from my perspective, we don't even, the space that we're playing in right now, I don't even know is really transferable to other organizations. The clinical variation just among our hospitals, even our no-show model, when we initially rolled it out, it didn't even work well at half of our facilities, and we had to make custom models to them. So the intellectual property from the actual model itself might not be super relevant, but maybe the process in which you create the model and can train it on local data, you might want to do something around that. But most everything we've done, we have no real interest in protecting, and we share it. And if I gave it to somebody, I would warn them, please don't implement this, do what we did on your own data. Take what we, because I don't expect it to work at your facility. I just really don't. Yeah.
I also want to add that, in some of my work working with very sensitive data that's never going to go out. For us, we will share, as Marzyeh was saying, our algorithms are things that we want to put out there. We want other people to be able to benefit from these. In terms, and possibly, at some point, models that are trained and can be directly useful in some applications as well. In terms of the data, obviously this type of very sensitive data is not going to be shared, but I am very interested in finding ways to enable other researchers in this area to also work on these problems and contribute to making progress on this together without necessarily having to build their own implementations or go through the same infrastructure types of challenges we did. And so, I'm interested in trying to figure out ways, whether through taking what we do have from our data, being able to generate other types of synthetic data or other ways in which people can still train models and for these types of applications, but without having access to, for example, our data that we work with exactly. And so, I think this is still a very open problem. It's a research area in itself, but it's something that I'm very interested in.
Yeah, we've pushed hard, as you may know, to release as much data as possible, as much labeled data as possible. It's been a learning process for us. I think that we've learned that to benefit the research community as a whole, and to sort of have the moral high ground, so to speak, in terms of the work that we're doing and the reproducibility and transparency. We release the data, we release the model, but it's so difficult to do that we are definitely exploring. We worked with the folks from Mimic as well, tried to get that co-release, get 500,000 X-rays out there. We think that the field's going to move forward because of that effort, hopefully. We learned a lot of lessons via the CS community with ImageNet, and we'd like to try to get there with medical images or, other data. But it's increasingly looking like, as, those of you out there are building the tools to help large healthcare systems put things in the cloud and make things movable, that we can get to a distributed model where we have partnerships with, say, Duke or, MIT or, Brigham or wherever, and we can move the models around, training on those data and just moving the weights. And that sort of helps us avoid a lot of the pain and suffering that go into releasing data the way we have. But on the other hand, it still doesn't let the little guy succeed. And what we want to see is the people that are, they're learning on Andrew's course on YouTube, and they want to get a data set and they want to get into the field. It's hard to do if you're just locking it down and making it federated only. So I think that there's two approaches that we're really excited about. And you notice that I didn't say IP at all. And that's not something that at least we're focused on. I think that there will be, certain pieces of this that will ultimately be owned by Stanford in some way, and that discussion will move forward. But I think that we haven't made that a singular focus of, frankly, any of the work that we've done, which has, maybe been good, maybe not, I don't know. Maybe the jury's still out. But it's something that we believe strongly, and again, is sort of the open source approach.
I think it's also important to note that this is a choice that this community gets to make, and it will inform the future of this community, right? So all computer science departments hire vision people, right? Like I trained at MIT, I am at University of Toronto now. You have your general ML person, you have a vision person. It's a subspecialty that people hire for. It has its own academic conference, right? So Vision made a choice, right? Fei-Fei Li created this ImageNet data set, right? And many additional data sets have come out. And these data sets have sometimes a little bit more restriction to get access to them if it's slightly more sensitive. But fundamentally, Vision made a choice that they were going to make these large public access data sets. And that is what has allowed state-of-the-art research to happen in universities and public institutions in Vision. That's why we hire from Vision, right, in universities. Speech is owned by companies. Computer science departments don't hire speech people. Why? Because you cannot train students in a public setting to use state-of-the-art models in speech because those data sets are private. And so if you want to do state-of-the-art speech, you go to a company. And so as a community, we need to make a choice about whether we're going to be like speech. If you want to do state-of-the-art machine learning for health, you have to be at Google or Microsoft or Apple, or it's a choice, right? Or we're going to be like Vision and empower state-of-the-art research to happen in a research sector.
Thank you.
Can we applaud that?
Great answer. So we'll do one last question, and it's just talking about. We've talked a lot about how the algorithms are tested and vetted, but I think we've had some interesting experience here in the clinical trial portion, the translation of that, and thinking about when do algorithms need to have that official clinical trial, and what are some of the unique considerations in making that happen?
All right, I'll start. We just did a trial. It was a learning experience for sure. I think that we picked a what we call low risk, low volume problem. We picked bone age to start, which is, I don't know if you guys know what bone age is, but it's something pediatric radiologists do. We don't particularly like it, but basically it's you take an x-ray of a child's hand, if they're having sort of questions about whether they're having advanced puberty or not, and you could tell the age of a patient, the skeletal age of a patient, and you compare that to their chronological age, and you say, well, you're advanced or not. Okay, so not a very common problem, but still important, and something that a machine is really good at doing, as we've found with the challenges we've hosted in the public data sets we've released in the past. But that doesn't mean that implementation as parts of trials is rubber stamped. It's not straightforward. And I think we had 9 institutions as part of this trial. And every one of them had, different infrastructure. They had different reporting schemas, different things the clinician wanted to see and didn't want to see. And so whether that needed a full clinical trial or not is, still subject to debate. But I think we've learned a ton. And imagine trying to do something that's, even higher acuity, something like brain hemorrhage, right? If my model is giving way too many false positives at one institution or another, when do you call it off? When do you make the decision as to whether this is just not suitable for use yet? And how do you go back and retrain it? So, but the trial is a trial. So, it's very regimented, very protocol driven. And that is something I personally believe in. I think that I'm concerned about the relatively rapid implementation that's going on maybe in other settings. And as a clinician sort of in this community, I feel as if it's my job to make sure that things are vetted just like a new drug in the same kind of very rigorous manner, and not letting this get out there and potentially hurt all of us if it's not vetted properly and doing what it said it needs to do. So, yeah.
Thank you, and we are out of time. So please join me in thanking all of the panelists.